Your prayers are very much appreciated. I know that you keep each of these individuals on our prayer list in your minds, and that is certainly helpful. All right, as I told you, we are going to be starting chapter 13 if you want to turn over there, but I want to reflect a little bit on where we've been. We are part of the way through this second longest vision in the book of Revelation. I've told you this many times. It's 13 chapters altogether, from chapter 4 all the way to chapter 16. So we're getting close to narrowing this one down. In this vision, we saw 7 seals that were open, revealing God's judgment. Then we heard 7 trumpets being blasted that were warnings about God's judgment. When we get to chapter 16, we're going to see 7 bowls of wrath, which will be implementing God's judgment. So those are the main symbols that we see in this second vision. But we've just explored chapter 12, and one of the things I told you about chapter 12 was I was looking forward to teaching that one because it answers so many questions that we have, particularly about Satan. Chapters 10 and 11, I mentioned to you, just leaves us with more questions than they do answers, but chapter 12 really gives us a lot of useful information. But at this time, I thought it would be beneficial for us to reflect on what we've learned thus far in the book of Revelation before we dive into chapter 13. The book is filled with symbolic language and descriptive images revealing things that are taking place all around us in this unseen spiritual realm, the unseen world. A lot of these things are taking place currently or have taken place in the past. Some of them are going to take place in the future. Revelation is a difficult book to interpret. And for this reason, it is not a book that we should be basing our doctrinal views and our beliefs on, because it is using symbolic language and descriptive images from these visions. There have been any number of false interpretations and false guidance given off of the book of Revelation, so we need to be careful when we interpret the book of Revelation. This book does, however, provide us with some excellent source material that will strengthen our faith as Christians and our understanding of the unseen world around us. Now, I've been giving you a series of slides that I call Decoding Revelation. I'm going to give you something different now today that I'm calling Unraveling Revelation. And there are certain elements in the book that we really can find undeniable truth. We can find items that we can hang our hat on as Christians. A lot of the things described in Revelation are really written to the first century Christians that were facing persecution. But there are certain elements, nuggets that we find in Revelation that really do speak to us. And one of those undeniable truths we ran into in chapter 11, verse 15, and this is the reign of Christ being foretold that he will reign forever. And the quote there is, when the 7th trumpet was sounded, a loud voice in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he, Christ, will reign forever and ever. And folks, I've mentioned this to you a couple times. This is the main theme of the book of Revelation, and it's one of these gems that we need to acknowledge. I would underscore it in your Bible, that this is one of these undeniable truths. Now, we run into a lot of things that we can really find beneficial in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is probably the best single source of information that we have in the entire Bible about Satan. We know a lot of things about Satan from other parts of the Bible, but for concentrated information, this is the chapter that I would turn to, is Revelation chapter 12. And there's an undeniable truth, and that is Satan is the true enemy of the church, of Christ and the church. And this comes across in many different ways. Some of the things that we read in chapter 12, verses 3 and 4, talks about Satan aggressively tried to prevent Christ from establishing the church. You see this image taking place in heaven of the woman who is pregnant, and this great red dragon waiting for the birth of the child so that he could devour the child. This is a symbolism of Satan trying to attack the kingdom of God before it could even be established. One of the things the verse doesn't tell us is how long Satan was there waiting. The woman represents the lineage of Christ, and Satan didn't know when Christ would appear. He might have been there waiting for generations for this Messiah to be born, ready to pounce, ready to devour this child as soon as they were born in this vision form. But it does reveal for us this truth that Satan is the true enemy of Christ. We also see that when Christ's mission on earth Here we go. And when Christ's mission on earth was over and he ascended back into heaven, there was a showdown. The text describes it as war in heaven. There was a showdown between the forces of good and the forces of evil in verses 5 through 8, where we see the archangel Michael leading the angels from heaven and against Satan leading his angels, his followers in heaven. And because Satan had openly opposed God's reconciliation plan for mankind, he and his angels were forcibly expelled from heaven in verse 9. Banished to earth and enraged with anger, Satan turned his fury upon the followers of Christ. We read that in verses 15 and 17. So all of this was going on behind the scenes during the time of the gospel while Christ was on the earth and he was conducting his ministry, and shortly after he ascended into heaven. All of this was taking place completely unbeknownst to us and people living on the earth. We can see the physical realm, but we cannot see what's happening in the spiritual realm. Christ, however, had the ability to see what was happening in the spiritual realm. Christ had knowledge of the things that Satan was doing. He had foreknowledge that Satan was going to be cast out of heaven as well after his ascension. So is it any wonder why Christ spent so much time warning his apostles about the terrible things that they would face after his departure? We read about these types of things. We're not going to turn to these, but Matthew chapter 10 talks about this. John chapter 15, there's Christ warning his apostles against things like persecution, false teaching, temptations, trials that they would be facing, actually being put in front of worldly leaders and kings. And all of these are tactics of Satan that Christ is warning them, because Christ knew that Satan was going to be cast out of heaven, and in anger he was going to be bringing turmoil, havoc against the early church. And so Christ was doing all that he could to prepare his followers, his church leaders, these apostles. He knew that the apostles themselves, as well as many other church leaders, would face direct assaults from Satan and his allies. But Christ knew one other thing that was very important. Christ also knew that these men that he had put so much faith in, these apostles, were going to be strong. And he knew that their faith would be fortified, and that the attempts that Satan had to destroy the church would be foiled. They would be thwarted because of the faith and the strength of the early Christians. So where we left chapter 12 last week, you will remember the woman had fled by wings of eagles into the wilderness where she was preserved. Christianity was being saved from Satan, from the serpent, it describes. But the way that we left chapter 12 is that Satan was unfettered. That's important. He was unbound. He was unfettered. There was no restrictions placed upon him, and he was enraged, and he was on earth. He doesn't have access to heaven any longer. And he's looking for ways now to expand his assault against Christianity and the early Christians themselves. So that is where we left off, and this is where chapter 13 will begin. In this chapter, we're going to see the rise of two beasts. Don't be frightened. These two beasts. They are allies of the great red dragon that we just talked about from chapter 12. These beasts are the instruments used by Satan in the persecution of Christians during the first century and a couple of centuries after that. They are the agents of the devil, and they are doing his will on earth. Chapter 13 will show us how Satan was directly influencing, I'm going to say it even stronger than that, how Satan was directly controlling the world during the time of the early church. Now, we understand that Satan influences the world today. He influences us on a daily basis. But Satan doesn't control us. There's a big difference. Today's time is different from the time that we're reading about here in the first, second, and third century. Satan was controlling men. He was controlling minds. He was controlling nations. And he doesn't have that ability any longer. He's influencing us, but he's not controlling us. So there's a big distinction. And we will understand that distinction more when we get into the next vision. That will be explained a little bit better for us. But for now, let's start with verse 1, chapter 13. And remember, the dragon is Satan. It says, "And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Now here's an artist's rendering of this beast coming up out of the sea. Pretty good rendering of what we just read. Verse 1 tells us that the beast that came out of the sea with 10 horns, 7 heads, represents the emperors, plural, emperors of Rome, who were directly responsible for the persecution of Christians. At the time of the writing of Revelation, I believe the emperor was Domitian. But there are 7 heads, and each of these heads represents a different emperor. The beast symbolizes global political power that was outspoken against Christianity and unrelenting in its blasphemous opposition to God. As one emperor would die, another would take his place, and the persecution of Christians would continue unabated. From one emperor to the next, the beast survived and continued, so persecution survived and continued. That's what the image is telling us. The 10 crowns worn by the beast, these were called diadems, and a diadem was a crown of rulership and authority. And it is no coincidence, I assure you, that this beast is described with the same number of heads and the same number of horns as the red dragon in the previous chapter, because this beast was in league with Satan. The beast, according to verse 2, received his authority, his power, and his throne from Satan. So make no mistake about it, Satan was the power behind the throne of Rome. He was pulling the strings. Satan kept the evil Roman emperors in power. Verse 3, we continue more about this beast from the sea, the Roman emperors. John says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been wounded, fatally wounded, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him? Verse 5, a mouth was given to him speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth with blasphemies against God and blasphemed his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So a lot going on here. Verse 3 tells us that one of the heads of the beast had suffered a fatal wound. And we'll read later on, it was as if a sword had struck it. But it was healed. And I believe that this fatally wounded head that was healed represents Nero, Emperor Nero, one of the former emperors. And this wounded head was a clue to the first century Christians to help them understand and ascertain exactly who this beast represents. Understand what was common knowledge at that time. There were lingering questions about what had happened to Emperor Nero for many years after he was gone. In actuality, what happened, Nero was a coward, but he feared for his life, and he fled Rome and secretly committed suicide with the assistance of one of his servants. Long after the announcement of his death, rumors persisted that Nero was still alive and planning some bloodthirsty return to power. And this unsettling rumor of Nero's return spread speculation and much fear throughout the Roman provinces. So you can imagine when John writes now about a fatally wounded beast that was healed, it can mean only one thing to these Christians, that the specter of Nero is still alive and still threatening us. That's the way they read it. And so that's why I believe that this fatally wounded head represents Nero, one of these emperors that was responsible for the persecution of Christians. This is just another one of those examples where first century Christians understood exactly what John was talking about, but we struggle with it because we are separated by we have the disadvantage of years. We're separated by several centuries. Cultural references and cultural knowledge of the time are forgotten over time, and it can make it difficult for us to interpret these recognizable symbols of the day. But the basic meaning is not lost. Whether we understood that about Nero or not, the basic meaning is still the same. The Roman Empire was evil to its core, and anyone assuming the throne was caught up in that evil. And notice in verse 5, the beast had given the authority, he was given the authority by Satan to act for 42 months. Now, that should sound familiar to you because we've seen the reference of 42 months already in the text. And I'm going to remind you again, this is the symbolic duration of limited tribulation. Same thing that's used in the book of Daniel, but it's used throughout the book of Revelation to describe the persecution, the Roman persecution. So whenever we see 42 months or 1,620 days, that's the same length of time, or 3.5 years, it's symbolic. It's not a specific number of days, but it's representing a limited period of time that God is going to allow this to happen. All right, let's continue now with verse 7. It was also given to him to make war with the saints, the beast from the sea, and to overcome them. And authority was given to him over every tribe, people, language, and nation. You know, the Roman Empire had conquered many, many different nations. And so Satan had given the Roman emperor this authority over these tribes, people, languages, and nations. Verse 8. And all who live on the earth, and remember, that's our code phrase for evil people. That's the way it's used always in the book of Revelation. So all the evil people who live on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written since the foundation of time in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slaughtered. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. Let me pause there on that last statement. Here's the perseverance of the faith and the faith of the saints. The word perseverance is one of these key words that John uses to describe some code language for these Christians to understand. When he wrote these 7 letters to the 7 churches, I defined for you at that time that the word perseverance was used primarily to talk about Christians that would not hail Caesar and worship Nero as their God, but they would not denounce Jesus Christ as their Lord. That was the way perseverance was being used at that point in the book. But now it has evolved. Perseverance is now being used for more than just that. Perseverance is really being used to describe the continuation and the survival of Christianity itself, of God's kingdom here on earth. So when we encounter this word perseverance, John is now writing about how this is how Christianity will survive. It's going to survive the persecution, and this is how it's going to happen. So in this passage, verse 7 tells us that the beast is waging war against the saints. Those were the early Christians. And this war took the atrocious form of the terrible Roman persecution. We know that. When the text says that it was given to him to overcome them, it means that the beast, the emperor, was doing the bidding of Satan and having Christians viciously slaughtered during the persecution. Verse 7 also tells us that Satan had given him authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So Satan's manipulation of people and events was widespread. It wasn't just the city of Rome, it wasn't just the Roman Empire. His influence, his control was widespread. I could say about that the persecuted Christians had virtually no relief, or they had no refuge, because Satan was in control of the nations throughout the early years of Christianity. These were dark times for Christians. They certainly were, because of Satan's attack. The beast was also worshipped by the wicked people who lived on the earth, from verse 8. And it tells us that their names are not found in the Lamb's book of life. That is the list of people that will be in heaven. Verse 10 says that anyone, and this is an important verse and it's kind of confusing, but it says, if anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here's the perseverance, the continuation, the salvation of Christianity, and the faith of the individual saints. What this is telling us is that the call for Christians who are being persecuted is not to resist the violence, but to endure it with faith, with the knowledge, trusting that God will ultimately vindicate his people. This passage shows us that God will allow persecution for a season, but he retains final authority, even during the persecution. So as we've done in the past, let's take just a moment and decode some of the things that we've learned. Last chapter we understood that the great red dragon is Satan. He's also referred to as the serpent. He's also referred to as the devil. What we've learned in this chapter so far is that this beast that came up out of the sea represents the line of Roman emperors, and the current emperor is Domitian, and one of his heads is very distinctive. It has this wound on it that would have been fatal, but for some reason he's still alive. I do believe that represents Emperor Nero. Now also, before we proceed on into this next beast, I want us to take just a moment, and I want to put a list up here of all the things that Satan gave to this first beast, this beast from the sea. He gave him a lot of important things. The dragon, Satan, gave him his power, his throne, and great authority, according to verse 2. Satan gave his authority to the beast, and the whole world worshiped the beast in verses 4 and in verse 8. Remember, the whole world would be wicked evildoers on the earth. Verse 5 tells us that a mouth was given to him, speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. Verse 7 tells us that authority to act for 42 months was given to him. I'm sorry, that was verse 5. And verse 7 tells us, verse 7 tells us that it was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And it also tells us that authority was given to him over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So the Roman emperor had a lot of power. He had a lot of control, and all of this power was attributed to Satan. Satan gave him these abilities and this authority. Now, that was the first beast, and I told you there's going to be two of them. We're going to meet the next one right here in verse 11. John says, "Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast in his presence. And he makes the earth and those who live on it worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down out of the sky to the earth in the presence of people. And he deceives those who live on the earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who live on the earth to make an image to the beast who has been wounded of the sword, had the wound of the sword, and has come to life." So here's a drawing of what that beast, the beast of the earth, the second beast, might have looked like. So another beast arose. This one came out of the earth, and it looked like a lamb, and it spoke like a lion. What that means is that the beast was very deceptive. He was Christ-like in appearance, but he was speaking with Satan's voice. The symbolism here, it exposes very easily who this is representing. It just barely masks the fact that this beast represents false prophets who are deceiving people. And we'll see that even more as we go on, as we read on. But I will remind you, in the Roman Empire, there was an officially recognized cult of emperor worship. And the priests of this cult taught that anyone in the vast, or everyone in the vast Roman Empire had to worship the emperor. So these were the false prophets of the cult of emperor worship. And those who refused to offer incense to the image of the emperor, they were either killed or they were exiled. According to verse 12 that we just read, the purpose of the second beast was to make men on the earth worship the first beast. And the first beast had derived his power from Satan. So you can see how Satan was in control of all of this that was going on between the emperor and the priests of the cult of emperor worship. Now remember, these are not literal beasts. These are visions that represent Satan's influence on the earth, specifically within the Roman Empire. The beasts of the earth, false prophets, also use some form of magic. I would call it some sort of illusion or trickery to perform signs that would deceive the people, verses 13 and 14. And we're going to see a little bit more of that trickery here as we continue our reading. Verse 15 tells us, "And it was given to him," this is the second beast, "to give breath to the image of the beast." This is a statue. This is a bust, a stone statue. "To give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak, and cause all who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, and the free and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads." That should sound familiar to you. Verse 17, "And he decrees that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name." And then John tells us something very puzzling here, verse 18. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and the number is 666. So John gives us the number, 666, but he doesn't tell us how it's calculated. He leaves that up to us, and I don't know of anyone that's been able to calculate that. Let's come back to that in just a moment. Verses 15 and 17 provides really a pretty accurate description of this cult of emperor worship, particularly as it was being utilized under the Emperor Domitian. I mean, it's almost as if a historian wrote this, but this is vision language. In the Roman Empire, if you wanted to legally purchase food or trade goods of any kind, you were required to bear this branded mark. A hot brand was put on your forehead or on your right hand, and this was the brand of Nero, or the brand of the emperor. And it was the priests, these false prophets in the cult of emperor worship, that administered this branded mark, and it was only done for those that would hail Caesar and worship Caesar as a god in the case of Domitian. And then it gets more interesting. By order of Domitian, anyone who would not worship him as their Lord and God would be executed or exiled in prison. I'm reminding you that for a reason, because I want to tell you something else, kind of a side note here. Let me tell you where I'm getting a lot of this. There were a lot of historical writings that were going on during this day, this point in time. We have more than just the book of Revelation to ascertain some of our knowledge of things that were happening in the Roman Empire. There were two ancient Christian writers, historians. They were compiling information about things that were going on that are not necessarily written in the Bible, but they've been proven to be fairly accurate. One was by the name of Tertullian, and the other one was by the name of Jerome. Tertullian wrote in chapter 36 of his work, Prescription Against Heretics, the same thing that Jerome wrote in chapter 9 of his book, Life of Illustrious Men. And what they described was both of them telling us that the Apostle John, the author of Revelation, was arrested when he refused to worship Emperor Nero. You know, he was called into the cult of emperor worship, asked to worship Domitian, and he refused to do that. He would not denounce Christ. So Domitian wanted to make a powerful example out of this outspoken apostle. He wanted to stifle the early Christians. He wanted to make an example out of John. He wanted to spread fear among the early Christians. So he ordered that John be executed in the most horrific way imaginable, and that was that he was to be boiled alive in a boiling cauldron of oil. This is not part of the Bible. This is what we're told by these historical texts. The only problem was that when the soldiers put John in the boiling cauldron of oil, according to these historical documents, God protected John. He protected him from the flames and from the boiling oil. Miraculously, no harm came to John whatsoever. And you can imagine how startled everyone was when they saw this. And Domitian was perplexed. Domitian realized that he was powerless to kill John. He couldn't kill John, and he feared that if he tried to kill John again and failed, it would just make him look weak as a leader, as an emperor. So instead, he had John exiled to the island of Patmos, where political prisoners were compelled to forced labor. So again, I caution you, this is not part of the Holy Scriptures, but it's collaborated that this story did take place. And it really reminds me of things that we read about in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, about Daniel in the lion's den, and God protecting Daniel from the lions, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, that they should have been incinerated, but they walked out without any harm. God has the ability to do this kind of thing for his people, for his servants, and he chose to protect John from harm in this boiling cauldron of oil. John should have been a martyr at this point in time, but he did not die, and he wound up on Patmos, and that part of the story is confirmed in the first chapter of the book of Revelation. We do know for a fact that John was writing the book of Revelation from Patmos. I just find that as an interesting side note. Now, I'm going to back up here. Verse 17 tells us that the first beast, the beast of the sea, had a unique number associated with his name. This was used as their brand. And this was the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is in direct contrast And the mark of the beast was a physical brand, and this is in direct contrast to the symbolic mark that God placed on the foreheads of his people in chapter 7. Verse 18 tells us that the number of the beast is 666, symbolizing humanity in rebellion against God. And there has been great speculation about the meaning of 666, but truth be told, we really don't know what that number means. I remind you, we are separated by 2,000 years away from the writing of this book, and it's just not possible for us to accurately interpret every symbol that we find in the book. One possible suggestion that I've heard is that the number 7 we know represents perfection, spiritual purity, and 6 falls short of 7. It may be just that simple. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. But if you read the passage, verse 18, closely, John also knew that this was going to be a problem verse for people because he started it by saying, here is wisdom, or your translation might say, this calls for wisdom. John was pretty accurate. A more accurate prediction there never has been, but it calls for a lot of wisdom, more wisdom than I have for sure. Okay, let's decode a little bit more here now that we're at the end of chapter 13. This beast from the earth represents false prophets, particularly the priest from the Roman cult of emperor worship. And Satan gave a lot of things to this second beast as well. He exercises all authority of the first beast in his presence, verse 12. The second beast performs great signs, which has been given to him to perform, verses 13 and 14. Verse 15 tells us that the second beast was given to him to breathe life into the image of the beast so that the image of the beast might even speak. I don't know if he was throwing his voice or what he was doing, but it deceived people to think that this statue, was able to talk. Verse 15 also tells us that it was given to him to cause all who do not worship the image of the beast, the first beast, to be killed. And in verse 17, also to decree that no one is able to buy or to sell except those who have the mark of the beast. So again, a lot of authority was given by Satan, not only to the emperors, but to these priests in the cult of emperor worship. And that leads us into chapter 14. We've got a few minutes, so let's see how far we can get here. This is a completely different story. Now, this is in direct contrast. We've just read a lot about these wicked people on earth that were being deceived by the emperor and by the priests of the cult of emperor worship. But now we're going to read about a different group of people. Verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder, like the voice, and the voice which I heard was like the sound of harpists playing their harps. We continue, verse 3. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one was able to learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased out of the earth. These are the ones who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are celibate. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been purchased from mankind as first fruits to God and to his Lamb, and no lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. So John sees another image now. This has nothing to do with the beasts coming out of the sea and the earth, but he has this vision of Mount Zion. John sees the Lamb, and that Lamb is Christ, by the way, accompanied by a symbolic 144,000 bearing the name of Christ and of God on their foreheads. This symbol, this sign, meant a sign of ownership, that they belonged to Christ and to his Father. A seal like this was always meant for ownership. This is in contrast to those who bore the mark of the beast from the previous chapter. Now I want to caution you on something here. This is the same number, 144,000, that we encountered earlier, but it's not the same group. In chapter 7, 144,000 was used to represent God's faithful people on earth that would be spared from his wrath. Now here in chapter 14, the 144,000 represents the martyred Christians who are now redeemed. So it's the same symbolic number, but a different multitude. So I'm saying it this way because I don't want you to fall trap to, many people teach that there's only going to be 144,000 people in heaven. I don't know how they base that from Revelation, because the 144,000 doesn't even represent a single group. There's two different groups being described here with this symbolic number that represents a multitude, a vast number of people or a vast number of souls. So again, I remind you, this is visionary language. It's very dangerous to try to base doctrinal beliefs and practices on visionary language. We just do our best to try to understand what it's telling us. Now, the Lamb is standing on Mount Zion. Why is that important? This symbolizes holy ground. I would describe this as heaven's ultimate vantage point. And the 144,000 were blameless and without blemish, according to verses 4 and 5. And when it talks about them not being defiled with women, for being celibate, this is a description talking about not following idols, not worshiping the Caesar, the emperor as well. So again, code language is used here quite a bit. These are consecrated to God. The text calls them the first fruits, and we would describe this as being the cream of the crop, or the choicest part of the harvest. They are singing a new song before the throne of God in verse 3. And this is the song of redemption. And this can only be understood and can only be sung by those who have been redeemed. The first 5 verses here in chapter 14 provides a vision of victory and purity among the worshipers of Christ. And this is in dramatic contrast to the beast worshipers that we just read about, who are not, their names are not found in the Lamb's Book of Life from chapter 13. Now, just a little bit of decoding. We've been adding to this list of the times that Christ's image is referenced in the book of Revelation. We're up to 8 now. He is the Lamb standing triumphantly on Mount Zion, and he's surrounded by the martyrs of the church who are now redeemed. Verse 6 tells us, "Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, with an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth." Remember, those are wicked people. "With an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and to every nation, tribe, language, and people. And he said with a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment is come. Worship him who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the springs of the earth, the springs of the waters.' And another," verse 8, "and another angel, a second one, followed, saying, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality.'" So John sees an image something like this here in chapter 12. The scene of angels flying in mid-heaven is reminiscent to the eagle that was flying in mid-heaven back in chapter 9, that also had a proclamation to make. The angel is announcing God's imminent judgment to come upon evildoers on the earth. And it would seem that this message is intended for more than just the Roman citizens. This eternal gospel is for all the nations and peoples who had been adversely influenced by Rome. So this represents God's judgment has begun, and the message in verse 7 is the hour of his judgment has come, so you need to worship him. Verse 8 tells us that a second angel flying in mid-heaven appears to John immediately following the first angel and proclaims disaster upon Babylon the Great. And this is the first time that we've seen Babylon mentioned. Well, it'll be mentioned as we continue. So we need to understand what's being talked about here. Babylon is not the city along the Euphrates River that you can see on the historical maps. Babylon was their code word for Rome. And John knew what their code word for Rome was. If they wanted to talk about the Roman Empire or the city of Rome, they talked about Babylon instead. So divine judgment is coming upon Rome, the great and wicked city. And when verse 8 says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great," this is the very first time in the book of Revelation where we read that Rome is going to be completely and totally destroyed. And we will see that actually happens in history in AD 396. So decoding Babylon the Great for your records, if you're taking note, that always is talking about the city of Rome. And I see now that time, unfortunately, has slipped away. I'm going to have to leave you with another cliffhanger, but we're getting into this great wine press scene, and it gets bloody before the chapter is over. So if you want to read ahead, finish chapter 14, and go ahead and read chapters 15 and 16 in order to finish out this second vision. We're going to be getting into these bowls of wrath in short order. But again, thank you as always for your attention, and I do hope and pray that you're finding this beneficial.